In a stunning and unexpected turn of events, Israel's ongoing military operation in Gaza has taken a devastating blow, one that analysts and observers are calling one of the most serious setbacks for the Israeli Defense Forces in decades. Reports emerging over the past several days indicate that thousands of Israeli troops have been lost in what was initially described as a decisive and carefully planned ground campaign. Now, questions are being raised not only about the strategic miscalculations that led to this catastrophic result, but also about the long-term implications for Israel's security, its regional posture, and its political leadership at home. The military operation, launched under the banner of dismantling militant networks and reasserting Israeli control over key areas in Gaza, was presented to the Israeli public as both necessary and achievable. Military officials, backed by the government, emphasized that the campaign would be swift, overwhelming, and ultimately successful in achieving its goals. However, what has unfolded on the ground tells a very different story. Instead of rapid advancement, Israeli troops found themselves entangled in fierce urban combat, ambushes, and improvised explosive attacks that quickly eroded both morale and manpower. Local resistance in Gaza, often underestimated by outside observers, proved to be far more organized and determined than Israeli planners had anticipated. Eyewitnesses describe scenes of intense street fighting, where Israeli units were drawn into densely populated neighborhoods that offered defenders countless opportunities for concealment and counterattack. Instead of open battlefields, Israeli soldiers encountered a maze of tunnels, booby-trapped buildings, and coordinated strikes that left entire battalions pinned down and vulnerable. Drone footage and leaked communications suggest that many units were cut off from supply lines, unable to receive reinforcements or even adequate medical support for the wounded. Military analysts say that one of the key factors in this collapse was Israel's reliance on overwhelming firepower rather than adaptive ground strategy. While airstrikes and heavy artillery were employed in the opening days of the campaign, these methods failed to neutralize the resistance's ability to fight back. Instead, they hardened the resolve of fighters on the ground, who were familiar with the terrain and prepared for prolonged combat. Reports also suggest that resistance forces had months, if not years, to prepare for such an incursion, stockpiling weapons, fortifying positions, and constructing an elaborate underground network that allowed them to move undetected and strike from unexpected directions. The result was catastrophic for Israeli forces. Casualty numbers, initially downplayed by official statements, began to leak through independent journalists, foreign correspondents, and even families of soldiers back home who received devastating news. The picture that emerged was shocking. Entire brigades suffering losses at rates unseen since Israel's wars of the last century. As news of the scale of the losses became undeniable, pressure mounted on the Israeli government to explain what had gone wrong. In Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, the political fallout was immediate. Protests erupted outside government buildings, with citizens demanding accountability for the operation's failure. Families of soldiers held vigils, some turning into angry demonstrations, calling out what they described as reckless leadership that had sent young men and women into a meat grinder with little chance of survival. Opposition leaders seized on the crisis, accusing Prime Minister and senior defense officials of arrogance, hubris, and catastrophic miscalculation. Internationally, the impact has been equally profound. World leaders who had cautiously supported Israel's right to self-defense are now recalibrating their positions in light of the staggering losses. Diplomats from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East are questioning whether Israel's strategy was ever viable or whether it was driven more by political imperatives than by sound military planning. In neighboring Arab states, the news has been greeted with both sympathy for the human cost of the conflict and renewed calls for Israel to reconsider its policies toward Gaza and the Palestinians more broadly. The United Nations has called for an immediate ceasefire, citing the humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Gaza, compounded now by the immense loss of Israeli troops. Human rights organizations point to the spiraling civilian toll inside Gaza, where thousands of non-combatants have been killed or displaced, and argue that the operation has backfired not only militarily, but morally and diplomatically as well. Images of devastation from Gaza are now being paired with images of funerals and memorials in Israel, creating a narrative of shared suffering that undermines the very rationale for continuing the offensive. Experts in military strategy suggest that Israel's leadership may have underestimated the psychological and political dimensions of urban warfare. While Israel has traditionally prided itself on superior technology, training, and intelligence, these advantages proved less effective in the confined, unpredictable battlefields of Gaza's cities. Instead, the determination of fighters defending their homes, combined with the tactical use of tunnels and improvised weapons, turned what was supposed to be a short and decisive campaign into a protracted disaster. Adding to the crisis is the question of how such a massive intelligence failure could have occurred. Israeli intelligence agencies, often regarded as among the best in the world, failed to predict the scale of resistance preparations. Some insiders suggest that political pressure to act quickly overshadowed the cautionary warnings of analysts who foresaw the risks of a ground invasion. Others blame overconfidence, arguing that years of technological superiority bred complacency and a dangerous underestimation of adversaries who have long been studying Israel's methods and preparing counters. As the death toll climbs, Israel now faces the grim task of reassessing not only its military strategy, but also its political direction. The government is under fire from all sides, with calls for resignations at the highest levels. The Israeli public, long accustomed to living under the shadow of conflict, is showing signs of profound disillusionment. The loss of thousands of troops has shaken national confidence, raising questions about whether Israel can maintain its image of invincibility and whether its leaders are capable of steering the country through this crisis. Meanwhile, in Gaza, the atmosphere is one of both devastation and defiance. While the civilian population suffers immensely under bombardment and displacement, the news of Israeli losses is being heralded by resistance factions as a historic victory. Propaganda videos, some verified and others likely exaggerated, are circulating widely, showing fighters celebrating destroyed Israeli vehicles, captured equipment, and abandoned positions. These images, while deeply polarizing, are shaping the narrative in the region. That Israel's attempt to impose its will on Gaza has backfired in a way few could have imagined. The ripple effects are also being felt across the wider Middle East. Regional powers are reassessing their strategies in light of Israel's weakened position. Countries that had been considering normalization deals with Israel are now hesitating, uncertain about the stability of a nation that appears to have suffered one of its greatest military defeats in modern times. Meanwhile, groups aligned with Gaza's resistance are emboldened, seeing Israel's losses as proof that determined resistance can succeed against even the most powerful armies. Economically, the crisis is beginning to take a toll as well. Israel's markets have reacted nervously to the news, with sharp declines in defense-related stocks and growing concerns about long-term instability. International investors are wary, and questions are being raised about whether Israel's economy, already strained by years of conflict, can absorb the shock of such a devastating military loss. At the same time, global media coverage is intensifying. Images of Israeli coffins draped in flags, grieving families, and military funerals are being broadcast alongside the destruction in Gaza, creating a narrative of tragedy on both sides. Analysts warn that this dual narrative could further erode Israel's international support as allies weigh the human cost against the strategic objectives that now seem increasingly unattainable. The question now is what comes next. Some within Israel's leadership argue that the only way forward is to double down, to push harder, and to achieve at least some form of victory to justify the immense losses. Others, however, warn that continuing the campaign risks compounding the disaster, leading to even greater casualties without achieving meaningful gains. Calls for a negotiated settlement, once dismissed as politically untenable, are now gaining traction as Israelis grapple with the reality that brute force has not delivered security. Voices within the military are also beginning to emerge, with reports of officers privately questioning the wisdom of the campaign. Some describe feeling abandoned by political leaders who prioritized appearances over strategy, while others speak of the demoralizing experience of fighting an enemy that seemed always one step ahead. Veterans of past conflicts are drawing comparisons to Israel's 2006 war in Lebanon, which similarly exposed vulnerabilities and sparked national soul-searching. Yet many argue that the current crisis is even more severe, given the scale of the losses and the stakes involved. As the dust begins to settle, historians and analysts are already framing this moment as a potential turning point in Israel's history. Whether it leads to a recalibration of strategy, a shift in political leadership, or deeper regional instability remains to be seen. What is clear, however, is that the operation that was supposed to secure Israel's safety has instead plunged the nation into uncertainty, grief, and controversy. For the families mourning the loss of their loved ones, these debates offer little comfort. Across Israel, funerals are being held daily, with communities coming together to honor the fallen. The scale of the tragedy is such that nearly every city and town feels the impact, creating a sense of collective mourning that cuts across political and social divisions. Yet, beneath the grief lies a simmering anger, a demand for answers, and a determination that such a disaster must never be allowed to happen again. In Gaza, meanwhile, the humanitarian crisis deepens. Entire neighborhoods lie in ruins. Hospitals are overwhelmed, and aid agencies warn of a looming catastrophe if the fighting does not stop. While resistance fighters celebrate their resilience, ordinary civilians continue to pay the highest price, caught between the machinery of war and the struggle for survival. The juxtaposition of suffering on both sides only reinforces the sense that the operation has achieved nothing but tragedy. As international mediators push for dialogue and ceasefires, the path forward remains uncertain. Trust between the parties is virtually non-existent, and the wounds inflicted by this operation will take years, if not decades, to heal. Yet the sheer scale of the losses may force a reckoning that no amount of rhetoric can obscure. Ultimately, the story of Israel's Gaza operation will be remembered not as a demonstration of power, but as a cautionary tale of overreach, miscalculation, and the limits of military force in achieving political ends. The thousands of troops lost are a stark reminder that even the most powerful armies are not invulnerable, and that wars fought without clear strategy and realistic objectives can end in disaster. For Israel, the challenge now is not only to recover from this devastating setback, but to rethink its approach to a conflict that has already claimed too many lives and promises only more pain if it continues unchecked.